Welcome to Her Story, the history of Southeast Asia told from her perspective. We'll discover historical figures, matriarchal societies, and contemporary female icons, and maybe learn about ourselves along the way. I'm your host, Agas Ramirez.
Pamantayan sa kababayan. Ang hirap ng isulat, magkakapagod na. Ngunit huwag kang bibigay, hindi kailangan mapunan. Huwag mo nang pakikinggan. Ikaw na yan, hayaan mo sila. Taas na ang tingin diretso.
Today, March 8th, is International Women's Day. Today is dedicated to celebrating women's achievements, acknowledging ongoing struggles, and pushing for real progress towards gender equality. And what better way to mark the occasion than by launching this brand new season of Her Story C Pod? By the way, the song you just heard is the chorus of the very newly released song Babae, that's the Filipino word for woman, by Pink Trash Project. Check them out using the links in the description. I've been listening to them all week and they are fantastic, so go give them some love. This season, we're focusing on one of the most significant parts of our regional history, Southeast Asia during World War II. From 1939 to 1945, the Second World War reshaped Southeast Asia, leading to the collapse of European colonial rule, devastating warfare, and the rise of independence movements. The region became a battleground between Japan and the Allied forces, and the effects of the war set the stage for post-war decolonization. How did women respond, resist, and rebuild in the face of violence? This is episode 31, Women, War, and Resistance, Southeast Asia in World War II. Before we start talking about Southeast Asia during World War II, it's important to understand what Southeast Asia is. These two things are inextricably linked. In Donald K. Emerson's iconic article, the question, "What is Southeast Asia?" turns out to be far more complex than it seems. This is the first article that I read when I started studying Southeast Asia, and it just completely blew my mind. So here's the thing. Instead of being just a simple geographic label, Southeast Asia is a mix of history, politics, and perception. Emerson explains that naming the region was initially driven by outsiders, especially Europeans, who used neighboring giants like China and India to define its borders. He writes, Westerners used more familiar shapes of India to the west and China to the north as mammoth landmarks to define the resulting zone in their perceptions. We were literally south of China, east of India. Emerson dives into how World War II played a key role in solidifying the idea of Southeast Asia, especially with the establishment of the SEAC, or the Southeast Asia Command, during the war. He notes, making war meant making maps, suggesting that geopolitical necessity pushed Western powers to view the region as a unified whole. Essentially, Southeast Asia referred to the region that was controlled by the Japanese that they had to take back. After the war, political events like the formation of SEATO, or the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and later ASEAN, helped to further cement the region's identity, even though these definitions were often based on politics rather than culture or geography. Interestingly, he points out that the concept of Southeast Asia became more standardized in the late 20th century, including countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. However, debates about its boundaries still linger. Should we include places like Papua New Guinea or Sri Lanka? Emerson argues that while today we think of Southeast Asia as a set of nation-states, historically it was more fluid and culturally diverse. In short, Southeast Asia isn't just a fixed place on the map. It's a concept shaped by external influences, wartime decisions, and evolving regional cooperation. So when someone asks, what is Southeast Asia? The answer isn't just about geography. It's also about Who gets to draw the lines and why? Much of the current map of the world is a record of the triumph of colonizers, and Southeast Asia is a very good example of that. Now that we've acquainted ourselves with the fundamental relationship of Southeast Asia with World War II, let's talk about the war in general and then focus on women. This episode is going to be an overview of what you can expect this season so we can get the most basic premises out of the way. Before the war, much of Southeast Asia was under European colonial rule. The British controlled Malaya, Burma or Myanmar, Singapore, and Borneo. French ruled Indochine or Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Dutch controlled the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, and the US governed the Philippines. We talked about this a lot in the previous season. This was a very significant period in the region's history, and it reshaped its culture, borders, governments, and people. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japanese warplanes launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. This was a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. In just a few hours, more than 2,400 people were killed, another 1,000 were injured, and multiple U.S. military ships and aircraft were destroyed. This pushed the U.S., led by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, into World War II. The very next day, the U.S. formally declared war on Japan. But the attack on Hawaii was just one part of a larger coordinated assault. That same day, Japanese forces targeted other key territories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They struck Guam and the Philippines, both U.S. territories, along with the British-controlled Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaya, now Malaysia. Japan also invaded Thailand, forcing the country to align with the Axis powers. These attacks reshaped the war's trajectory. While Japan never occupied Hawaii, it did seize Guam, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, and the Dutch East Indies. The occupation of the Philippines lasted 3 years, making the islands one of the key battlegrounds of the Pacific War. World War II was fundamentally a war of empires fighting over land and resources. In Europe, Germany sought to expand its territory under Adolf Hitler, driven by violent anti-Semitism. In Asia, Japan's imperial ambitions clashed with the interests of the US and Britain. Economic sanctions, particularly a US oil embargo, crippled Japan's energy supplies, and feeling trapped, Japan launched an offensive to seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. As historian Eri Kitada explains, oil was crucial to Japan at this moment. Feeling cornered, Japan panicked and launched an aggressive military campaign across the region. Let's talk a bit more about the war in the Philippines. Just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japan bombed U.S. air bases in the Philippines, including Clark Field, though due to time zones, this happened on December 8 locally, but officially it's December 7. The attack wiped out nearly an entire fleet of American fighter planes and bombers, marking the beginning of a 5-month battle. Thousands of troops were killed, with many later dying in the Bataan Death March in April 1942. Though Roosevelt focused on Pearl Harbor in his speeches, the U.S. responded immediately in the Philippines. In the days following the attack, American officials in Manila began imprisoning Japanese civilians living in the islands. This was months before similar actions were taken in the U.S. under the Japanese internment policy. However, by the end of December, Japanese forces freed those civilians as they gained control over the Philippines. By May 1942, Japan had fully occupied the Philippines alongside Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Guam, and Indonesia. The Pacific and Southeast Asia had become a major front in the war. Japan's occupation of French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia also became a key moment in the region's wartime history. Japan promised to liberate Southeast Asia from colonial rule, but instead, it installed military governments and exploited the region's resources and oppressed its people. For much of the war, Japan held on to its occupied territories, but by 1944, the tide turned. The U.S. recaptured Guam in July 1944, and by October, General Douglas MacArthur launched a campaign to retake the Philippines. This is where his famous line, "I shall return," comes from. The battle for the Philippines lasted until 1945, August 1945, the same month the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered soon after, marking the official end of World War II. Remember, this is a very condensed version of what happened, and there will be a lot more details that we'll discuss later. The war permanently changed Southeast Asia. The Southeast Asian theater was marked by initial Japanese dominance, followed by a strategic Allied response. The eventual Allied victory not only ended Japanese expansion, but also set the stage for significant geopolitical changes post World War II. While Guam remained a U.S. territory and Hawaii later became a U.S. state in 1959, the Philippines gained independence in 1946. In the years that followed, dozens of former colonies across Asia and Africa fought and won independence, reshaping the global political landscape. Now, let's focus on women in Southeast Asia, who were often thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Women across the region, both locals and expatriates, contributed in various ways, including as resistance fighters, spies, medical personnel, and laborers. Some were, of course, victims of war crimes, and that is something we will be discussing at length this season. Here are a few more details, and you can expect more on this as we go on. First, one of the most horrific wartime atrocities was the forced sexual slavery of thousands of women under the Japanese military's Comfort Women system. Women from across Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaya, and Burma, were abducted or coerced into military brothels. Many were falsely promised jobs as nurses or factory workers. Indonesian women, including young girls, were among those taken by the Japanese occupation forces. The Dutch government later recognized that Dutch Indonesian women or Eurasian women were also victimized. Filipino women were among the largest groups of Southeast Asian victims. Survivors such as Maria Rosa Henson later spoke out about their horrific experiences.
Fighting for justice. These women have kept silent most of their lives, traumatized and ashamed of being forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II. Hilaria Bustamante is nearly 90 years old. She clearly recalls the day she was abducted.
Noong bagsak na ako, ang ginawa nung isang Hapon.
One Japanese soldier started to rape me while the other two held my arms and legs down. When he was done, the other one started. Even though I was screaming because of the pain my body was in, they kept at it.
After the war, many victims faced social stigma, preventing them from speaking about their suffering for decades. The Japanese government has been criticized for failing to fully acknowledge or compensate the victims. Second, many women actively participated in anti-Japanese resistance movements. Josefina Veluya Guerrero, Nieves Fernandez of the Hukbalahap, Claire Phillips, Lakshmi Sagal of the Jhansi Regiment, Rasuna Said, Sibyl Katigaso, Elizabeth Choi, Suryani Abdullah, Shamsa Fakeh of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, Rambay Barni and the Seri Thai movement, Nguyen Thi Dinh and the Viet Minh. These are just some of the women we'll be talking about this season. Third, the Japanese exploited local populations for labor and resources. For example, women and men alike were conscripted into forced labor working in dangerous conditions on infrastructure projects such as railways and airstrips. One example is the Thailand-Burma Railway, also known as the Death Railway, where thousands of Southeast Asian laborers died from malnutrition, disease, and brutal working conditions. We'll be talking about the Thailand-Burma Railway in this season as well. Finally, the war disrupted and destroyed many social structures, forcing women into new roles. For example, with men either killed or recruited into forced labor, many women became the sole providers for their families. Then, prostitution increased in occupied cities like Manila and Singapore, where women had few other options for survival. Clearly, we have a lot of ground to cover this season. As we begin to reflect on the role of women in Southeast Asia during World War II, we see stories of resilience and defiance. Women resisted the occupation, fought in guerrilla movements, endured forced labor, and in too many cases, suffered horrific war crimes. Their contributions helped shape independence, political landscapes, and ongoing fights for justice. Today, like I said, is International Women's Day. And it's 2025, so we do have to ask ourselves, how much progress have we really made in the last decade? According to the World Economic Forum, at the current rate, gender equality won't be fully realized until 2158, 5 generations from now. That's why this year's theme, Accelerate Action, is a call to speed up progress. So, what can we do? We don't have to lead an army or go underground like the women of the resistance, but there are steps, big and small, that can push us forward. First, speak up. Challenge discrimination, call out harmful stereotypes, and push for gender inclusive policies, whether in your school, at work, and on social media. Second, support survivors. The fight for justice for wartime sexual slavery survivors is still ongoing. Educate yourself, amplify their voices, and support organizations seeking accountability. Third, empower women and girls. Whether it's through education, mentorship, or economic support, lifting women up benefits entire communities. And, of course, remember and share HERstory. Center women's stories and look for ways to share them so they can continue to inspire new generations. The women of World War II fought for liberation, survival, and dignity. Today, we continue that fight in different ways, but with the same determination. So let's not wait 5 generations for gender equality and accelerate action now in our own ways. Thank you for listening to episode 31, Women, War, and Resistance, Southeast Asia and World War II. Like I said, this is just an introduction and there's much more to come. Shout out to our patrons, Shireen, Geranian, Shamiba Milish, Jennifer, Christina, Raymond, Matt, Ashley, Chanda, Yati, and Christopher. Head on over to Patreon right now to listen to 10 bonus episodes and get access to full scripts and reference materials. You can also send me a message if you have any comments or questions. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Threads, and Instagram at HerStoryZPod. And also check out Pink Trash Project's links in the description. This podcast was hosted and edited by Agas Ramirez. Season 3, can you believe it? See you soon.